Hello guys, what's up? Hope you're good. So in this video, what we're going to be looking at are trend lines. What are trend lines? How you can use them in your trading to make your trading better and have a sharper edge in the market. So if that sounds interesting to you, please do stick with us until the end. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on that bell notification so that you'll be notified whenever we release content in the future. Cool. Now, what are trend lines? Trend lines, these are nothing but diagonal support and resistances. The only difference with them is that they are diagonal. So we all know support and resistances are, or what we so-called market structures. Everybody has a different name to it. Supply, demand. They all serve the same purpose, right? So typically it's a zone like this, order blocks, whatever. But typically it's like this, right? But it's horizontal. Now with the trend line, the only difference with it is that it's diagonal. So that means it's a little bit steep like this. And yes, I do know some of you might have the question like, for instance, the support and resistances. Most of the times, or some traders actually sometimes indicate it as a line like this, but to our understanding, we know that it's not a line, it's a zone. So when it comes to trend lines, yes, it's not also a line, it's also a zone. So rather than it being like this, it's something like this. So that's a trend line. That's a trend line, right? I know, shocker. But that's the trend line. Now, how can you add on trend lines according to your on your edge so that they can actually be of benefit to you and your trading, right? Now, trend lines, first, there are a couple of rules that you need to follow while drawing trend lines. And after you draw them, there are still a couple of rules that you need to follow so that you can know if a trend line is still valid, if it's not valid, or once you take a trade using a trend line, where should be anticipating to see the trade go, and what you should know if the trade is still valid to continue holding. Cool. Now, first things first is obviously while drawing a trend line, because that's the first thing that you need to do before you actually even take a trade is draw a trend line. Now, there are a couple of rules that you need to follow while drawing a trend line. So the first thing is you need to spot a trend in the market. So for instance, for instance, let's assume, let's remove this trend line here. It's not in play. Let's assume we spotted this downtrend here. And the word trend line actually implicates what it actually represents, a trend line. Let me write it down so that it can actually be clear. This is a trend and then line. So it's a line that actually determines the trend. So in the market, once you spot a trend, it's very easy for you to actually place a trend line. Because for instance, if you have that high, you can then place this second high, and then you have third high there, right? So you can see that, right? It's a 1, 2, and then you have here a third touch, right? Cool. Now that's the way you actually place a trend line. You need to first spot a trend, and then after spotting a trend, you need to have at least 2 reversals. Like this is the first reversal, like prices came here and then reversed, prices came here and then reversed. So you need to have at least 2 turning points for you to actually place your trend lines before you actually let it ride, You need at least 2 trend line points, 2 touching points. Because sometimes I see a lot of people, for instance, sometimes they draw a trend line like they say this is my first point, and then this right here is my second point, maybe something like this. This is not valid. This is not a valid trend line because prices are still on this point here. They haven't concluded, they aren't done. We're not sure if prices will reverse or if will break through. So you can't consider this a valid point. And this is one of the mistakes I'll see a lot of people doing while drawing trend lines. So you should really avoid that, right? But rather, you need to actually have at least 2 touching points. Like for instance, that's the first, and that's the second right there that you can use for your trading. and granted. After that, you can just let it ride. Now, there are a couple of things that you need to actually know if the trend line is still valid or if it's not valid, so that you can actually know if you're still going to use it or you should remove it from your trade, right? Now, the first thing is that a trend line, first, while drawing it, you need to actually pinpoint these turning points at exactly these turning points. That's where you actually place your trade, your trend line. Okay. You don't want to place a trend line like this. You don't want to do that. You want to place it at the very tip. That's how it's more accurate, because it shows that's the maximum rejection point, right? And you want to be precise with that because it will actually give you much more accuracy in your trading. The second thing that you want to look at is, or for you, if you are to determine if the trend line is still valid, is that prices, for instance, you see here prices are piercing or have pierced through the trend line, but failed to close above it. You can see how it shows the strength that the trend line is still strong. It's valid. That's why prices were rejected. And then now they're trying to keep on going high. But it showed rejection. So it shows the trend line is still having strength, right? Now, first thing, for a trend line to be valid, you'll see rejections. Once prices approach it, that's the first indication to indicate if a price or if a trend line is still valid. The second thing, or something that will actually make a trend line become devalued, like to show like it's no longer valid, is that prices will break through it. So for instance, okay, cool. So let's say, excuse me. So if, for instance, we had a trend line maybe somewhere in here, this is just for example, right? So this was the first touch, and then this was the second touch right here, right? Until here, it was valid, right? So prices continued going lower. You can see here, after this, after all this mess right here, this can no longer be considered a valid trend line because prices have already broken above it and below, danced about, like they violated it, if I use the word. They have mutually violated it brutally. So it's no longer valid. So if a trend line, if candles cross through the trend line over 2 times, right? Over 2 times, that's no longer valid. You need to remove it from the trend. Like for instance here, this can no longer be valid, so you have to remove it. Over 2 times, what I mean is that if prices break above it and then come back up below and then break above it, that's over 2 times. That's no longer valid. It's no longer valid and you need to remove it. So like for instance here again, as I was saying, this can no longer be valid, although it was valid all the way until here. And then once this happened, it's no longer valid. So you always need to know when the trend line is valid, when it's not, so that you can actually remove it and move on to better things, right? All right, cool. Now, as I said, you need at least 2 points in your trading so that you can actually know where to actually take advantage of the trend line and when to ignore it. So let's get back to this example again. So for instance here, you see that, right? Okay, now let's assume, let's put it on a theoretical base. That's our trend line. We have the first touch where prices came here. And then we have a second touch. So this is called the first touch. This is called the confirmation touch or the second touch. And then once prices touch here on the third touch, this is called the trigger. Now this trigger is where you'll be anticipating to take a trade to go to the downside as a rejection, right? However, you don't take the trade just on the touch. You have to wait for the confirmation. So for instance here, for those that would have taken the trade just at the touch, you'll be now floating at a drawdown. But it's never the case. You should never do that because you need to wait for the confirmation. We as price action traders, we can never always insist on how important confirmation is to a trade. You always need to wait for confirmation. So for instance here, we are on our third touch. Prices have not yet still broken and closed above the trend line. So if this candle, for instance, closes with a bearish momentum engulfing this candlestick here, this will be our confirmation and we'll take a sell trade. Okay. We always have to wait for confirmation on the third touch to take a trade. Now, that's the first spot where you can actually take advantage of a trend line to take a trade. The second spot is after a breakout. So for instance, this happens and prices break above here. Where should we be anticipating, or how should we be playing this out? The trend line is broken. And the trend line, at the beginning of the session, as I told you, it indicates the trend in the market. It indicates the trend in the market. So that means the trend has been broken. After a trend is broken, what do? You look for the reversal trade. That means you'll be looking for a trade to go higher, right? So that's the same thing with the trend lines. If prices break above here, we should be looking for a retest and a continuation. But the advantage of also using a trend line is that after a trend has been broken like this, most times, rather than not, prices always go back to where the trend began. So for instance, if this happens, if prices break above here, then we should be seeing prices push all the way until they reach back up here where the trend began. That's just the characteristic or the nature of a trend line, right? So if prices break above here, we will be looking for a retest for entries to push all the way until somewhere up there. That's just the characteristic of the trend line. And if prices bounce off here, they give a confirmation for a sell setup, and we look for a trade to sell. Unfortunately, using the trend line, you can't determine where to place your take profit, but using the Fibonacci extension tool, you can know exactly where to place your take profit, which is something that I will talk about in another video. So if you'd like me to talk about that, please be sure to subscribe and turn on the bell notification so that when I do post about it, you won't miss out. As far as trend lines go, that's the basics, or those are the basics of what you need to know about trend lines. And that's all I've prepared for you guys today. So if this video has been of help to you, please like, subscribe, turn on the bell notification, share with a few friends that you believe the video will be of help to them. Till next time, I appreciate you guys. Nothing but love from this side. Peace.